I'm going to talk a little about addressing risk in supply chains. When I was asked to do this in the first instance, I thought I was going to be talking to a bunch of restaurateurs and food service people. I don't know if you are restaurateurs and food service people, but I've made it quite general, quite deliberately. I work for a company called the William Jackson Food Group. We'll come to them in a second. I'll say who we are, but I won't spend much time on that. And then we'll run through those items, and if I manage to keep to time, then we'll have some time for questions at the end, but I'm not very good at keeping to time. So the William Jackson Food Group comprises those businesses. Hopefully you'll recognise one or two of those names. The chap with the beard is William Jackson, who founded the company in 1851. The chap to the right is his great-great-grandson, who is the current chairman. It's still family-owned, which is a great bonus in the world of sustainability because it means you have a genuine generational interest in how to make things work. I work in the ESG world, and I'm approaching risk from the perspective of environmental, social, and governance issues, perhaps, rather more from the perspective of your standard commercial risk. But that is clearly an issue as well. So, first of all, understanding risk. Does anybody know what the World Economic Forum does? No, nor me, but every year, January or February, the great and the good of business, government, NGOs, and unaccountably Bono all get together and talk about the world's ills and woes. Other rock stars are available. And they tend to look, amongst other things, at likelihood and impact of issues that might be affecting the world. Hopefully you can see the big boxes, but if you can't see the key, light blue is economic, green is environmental, yellowish is geopolitical, red societal, and purple is technological. And so they consider the risks that face society. This is public domain stuff available from the World Economic Forum's website every year. And what you will see is there is a predominance in terms of impact of the green and red categories, so environmental and societal. And those of you who are eagle-eyed and think water crises are actually classified now as societal issues. If you go back far enough in this, earlier than 2016, water was down as an environmental issue. It's now regarded as a societal issue. I have seen a very compelling argument that says that the Syrian civil war can be traced back to environmental causes. Clearly, there are lots of issues in Syria that weren't environmental, but failure of rain, failure of harvest, economic collapse, and then all the issues that were there in Syrian society were brought to the surface. So you don't need to look very far before you get to some quite significant issues. So do we in our business lives day to day consider this kind of issue? Hands up anybody who thinks about this kind of thing in their business planning. Okay, one or two hands, one or two liars maybe, one or two very embarrassed people who don't want to be put on the spot. So risk exists in all sorts of areas, and it exists in areas which are, if you like, non-conventional. Now, we are not, I don't suppose anybody here represents a national government. We'll be from businesses ranging from tiny up to quite large, as we've just heard. This kind of thing impacts on all of our lives every day to a greater or lesser extent. So risk is out there, and we need to think about the type of risks that we want to consider in our lives. Now, the weapons of mass destruction thing, hopefully, since apparently Donald Trump fell in love with Kim Jong-un, as we'll have seen in some of the recent press coverage, maybe that's going to be deemed to be a less likely challenge going forward. But mostly environmental and social, so things that impact all of us in our day-to-day lives. Who's in favour of plastic wrapping on cucumbers? Who is against plastic wrapping on cucumbers? Who was against plastic wrapping on cucumbers before Blue Planet 2? Yeah, okay. So our lives have changed a bit as a result of some publicity. Now, if you look at the life cycle assessment, it will tell you unequivocally that from a carbon perspective, you are better off wrapping a cucumber because it prevents the cucumber from degrading, extends its shelf life. Now, does that mean you're going to eat it just because it's got extended shelf life? Not necessarily. If it's got no plastic wrapping on it, it might last a few days less, but maybe you'll eat it faster. If it's got plastic wrapping on it, does it mean that plastic wrapping is going to go and choke a turtle somewhere? Not necessarily. It might be collected and disposed of very responsibly. So you can take one measure, which is the carbon impact of a decaying cucumber or not, versus the amount of carbon involved in producing a plastic wrapper, and you can make a decision. But there are risks either way in doing that. Maybe a carbon risk, maybe another environmental risk. We're quite fortunate in the UK in that we live in a society where the waste collection system provided by local authorities is fairly robust. In Egypt, only 20% of domestic refuse is collected by municipal authorities. Where does the other 80% go? Inevitably into the environment. Now, we might be quite smug because we collect ours in the UK, but we will all know in this room that at the very beginning of this year, the Chinese government decided to stop allowing imports of waste from other countries, including ours, because it was contaminated, which reduced its value. So we are actually exporting our problem. Of the world's ocean plastics, 90% arise from just 10 river systems, 2 in Africa, 8 in Asia. Is there any guarantee that the plastic wrapping that you collect from your cucumber and put in the appropriate coloured bin in your kitchen has not then been exported to end up in the Yangtze? Maybe, and therefore in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific. William Jackson Food Group, in fact, anticipated it. I'm pleased to say one of the targets which you won't be able to read from the back, or indeed possibly even from the front, apart from the titles here. We said well before, 18 months before Blue Planet 2, that by 2025 all of our consumer packaging will be recycled material, recyclable or compostable in the home. Now, lots of other people are saying that now. Was there a risk in saying at that point in time when the system around us wasn't developed enough? Well, probably not. You could see it coming. You could see it was going to happen. Nevertheless, we went out on a bit of a limb, but much bigger organisations than us now are going through all sorts of hoops to develop the technology. Iceland most famously, but there are plenty of others. Anybody use plastic straws still? Not in polite company, no. You'd be mad to, wouldn't you, really? Okay, when you ask consumers what concerns them about food, the majority of things, this is FSA data, they conduct this every year or two, Food Standards Agency, published in DEFRA's pocketbook every year. You ask people what concerns them. So where is the risk for you in the food system? Hopefully you can all read this. Most of those things have to do with personal health, some which has just been touched on by the previous speaker. And this is about things that food will do to me if I consume it. There are one or two nods to other issues. So you've got animal welfare and you've got food miles in there. Now, food miles is often used as a proxy for environmentally bad, but of course it depends very much on how those miles are being travelled, what mode of transport you're using. But it's a kind of a shorthand. So actually, what people are saying when they talk about food miles is some sort of vague kind of environmental impact that I can't quite manage to articulate, but I'll use food miles as a proxy. If you come a little more up to date, this is 2015, 2016 figures, it's moved a bit, but not a lot. And there's a certain amount of movement around these depending on what's going on at the time. Now, unfortunately, the way these colours have come out makes it a little bit harder to see, but research that I've conducted over the last few years, when you ask people to, on a 100% basis, to ascribe responsibility for sustainability in society amongst these four groups, government, business, civil society, NGOs, and individuals, that's how it breaks down. Hopefully you can see the distinction between these rather two similar colours here, similar to my eyes anyway. Government usually comes out first, but it depends on the age group. The older people are, and arguably the more experience of government they've had, the less faith they have in government's ability to make change. But by and large, business as a group is where people sit. That's the largest responsibility sector. So here we are, all organisations that are businesses, by and large. Anybody not private sector in the room? Okay, 100% of us. So people out there, people downstream of us, our customers, the people that pay for our products and services or pay our salaries and mortgages, expect us to be managing those and other risks on their behalf. So, more specifically, GlobeScan did this in 2015. It's done fairly routinely, and you get this kind of response quite regularly. What does that mean? How are you being held accountable? Well, you can see the things down there. Now, some of these are evidenced perhaps more regularly in consumers' behaviours when they go out shopping than others, and some of these are enormous. So how do you not harm the environment? How do you manage a supply chain? Anybody have to produce a modern slavery statement? Not many. Okay. Just going through the iteration, presumably the third one round. The Modern Slavery Act, 2015 Modern Slavery Act, in the UK has pushed similar legislation in Australia. Other legislatures around the world are likely to follow suit. The Modern Slavery Act requires companies above a certain size to state publicly what they do to mitigate the risk of human trafficking and modern slavery in their supply chains. Now, you are allowed legally to say, I do nothing. That's a perfectly acceptable response legally. Is that an acceptable response from the perspective of stakeholders? Would you, sir? Would you say that? We do nothing about modern slavery in our supply chains. Of course you wouldn't. So you are now obliged to go away and do stuff down a complicated supply chain, most of which you probably can't see. So that's an enormous thing bundled in there. And what consumers don't do is tell you how they expect that to be evidenced. You've got to do that for yourselves. And maybe if you don't do the things that at some subsequent point they decide they're looking for, then they'll hold you accountable. So evaluating risk. This is the aqueduct map, a water stress map. No great surprises there. The hot parts of the world have high levels of water stress, so they're coded in red. But if you zoom into the map a little bit, you'll see that the part of the UK where we're sitting now is in a highly water-stressed area, primarily because there's a large concentration of people and concrete, which stops water being absorbed back into the ground, large amounts of consumption. So we might think that water stress is an issue that affects the obvious parts of the world, the arid parts of the world. But no, it's here for us as well. Different variations of this map at different times over a chronological series will show you that London particularly is highly water stressed as well. So if you take a food type, we all eat sandwiches, I'm sure, at one time of our lives or another. One of the companies in the William Jackson Food Group is the UK's largest manufacturer of retail sandwich bread. I've chosen these two, cheese and tomato and BLT, because they're the top sellers of a particular retail chain. I was involved in a project with them a few years ago. So if you look at the sandwiches and you look at the amount of water, you may be surprised to know, or you may not, because of the type of people that you are, the type of jobs that you do, that pigs and cows are huge consumers of water, at least as regards the amount of output that turns up as bacon and cheese, much more so than crops that don't go through animals to reach us. So if you've got an issue around water risk, thinking back to that map, you may be surprised, firstly, where the water is used, and secondly, with that zooming in, quite a lot of cattle in the western part of England. So if you've got cattle in a water-stressed area producing a highly water-intensive product, it may actually be that some of your risks are closer to home than you realise. And it varies a bit. I'm afraid my grey has come out as a rather different colour on this slide, but that's blue, green and grey water. So green water, which falls out of the sky, blue abstracted from the environment, and grey water, which is recycle it from used water. Different parts of the world have very, very different statistics. If you grow your wheat in arid areas, there's a lot of evapotranspiration. You might even need to irrigate wheat. You don't see wheat being irrigated in the UK, but you do see it being irrigated in other parts of the world. So if you look at where water comes from into the UK, WWF figures here, these are items that are associated with BLT and cheese and tomato sandwiches. An awful lot of water is used in those. And different data sets, so it doesn't entirely coincide with this, we're importing an awful lot of water from very dry countries. So in the food system, there's a lot of risk. That's continuity of supply is a big issue, potentially. I've had the 5-minute warning, which means I'm probably not going to get onto the mitigation. You'll just get all of the bad news and none of the good news. I'm sorry about that. Talking too slowly. This is a chart of the share prices of two electronics organizations which make hard disk drives. And it relates to the floods in Thailand back in 2011. This is their share prices relative to the NASDAQ on which they were both quoted. So you can see on the face of it, at least, being a hard disk drive manufacturer is quite good because you outperform the exchange at which you're listed. Then there was heavy rain in northern Thailand, and so their share prices dropped. Then there was a little bit of a worry, what's going to happen in Bangkok? One share price recovered, the other share price didn't. Guess which one had the factory that got flooded? Guess which one had the factory that they knew wasn't going to get flooded? No, neither of them. Because if they'd known, that drop wouldn't have happened. They'd have been able to say to the industry, no, don't worry, we're fine, we're on a hill. We're not going to get flooded, but they didn't, because they couldn't. So neither of them had evaluated that particular type of risk effectively. And you can see there's a 6-week lag effectively here. You imagine what the difference is, the cash difference in that gap across all that period of time because of the risk of flooding or not. So too little water, too much water. So this is now going to be a gallop through potentially some of the good news. First of all, there are frameworks to follow. Who uses the Sustainable Development Goals in their business planning? Okay, who has not heard of the Sustainable Development Goals? Oh, well, that's something. So this is a framework that you can use to manage environmental, social, and governance risk issues. Now, if you go down a level, you'll find a lot of the detail in this is not framed in a way that's particularly accessible to business. It's much more for governments. Nonetheless, it is a useful steer, and you can build some of your risk management systems around the risk inherent in the way that those are articulated there. However, be careful, because PwC did some work last year where they asked businesses and they asked members of the public which you think of those 17 are the most important. And you can see on the left-hand side, business, perhaps unsurprisingly, talked about decent work and economic growth. Well, that's what business is for, so there's no great surprise there. Talked about climate action. Well, carbon and climate change is in the news all the time. No great surprise there. And at around that time, we were coming out to the gender pay gap reporting regulations, so you could understand why that was maybe front of mind for business, because the world in business was changing. What were the public thinking about? Well, something entirely different. At the same time, lots of press coverage of food banks and hunger. So maybe that's what was driving the response of the man and woman in the street. If you were to repeat that exercise now, post-Blue Planet, maybe you get a different set of issues. The world around us moves on. The really unfortunate thing is that business thought that no poverty was a really low priority, whereas the people who buy the goods and services from business thought it was a high priority. So make sure you do your market research properly as part of a means of trying to address risk. You've got accreditation schemes. I won't dwell on this for too long. You will all, I hope, recognize one or more of those. Now, accreditation schemes have their limitations, of course. They are firstly focused on an area, and they don't talk about the rest of what goes on in the value chain. And even if you get recyclable board right, does that necessarily mean that the rest of your issues are managed correctly? So you need to be careful in terms of how you use those, but they can at least support a process and take away some of the work. You can collaborate with other partners. A few examples there, some of which, again, you'll recognize, some of which you might not. Come and ask me afterwards if there are any you're particularly interested in or are particularly unfamiliar. But there are ways of working together to make sure that you reduce the burden on any given organization. We heard some of that from Plavlis before, which they can do within a large organization. You can do that with your colleagues. These are ways of doing it beyond the boundaries of your commercial entity. And then you can use management systems. We'll all be familiar with the health and safety hierarchy, and that can be reflected very simply in other considerations. Just don't do it. If it's too risky, don't do it at all. If you have to do something like that, well, invent something that's less risky. If you have to do it, then you manage it. If you can't manage it, ask a third party to manage it, and that goes back to the accreditation schemes. And if there isn't an accreditation scheme, just ask somebody to take care. Now, I was in France on holiday recently. You may know there's a hunting culture in France. People go out shooting. And if you go walking in France, then there are rules for walkers. And one of them says, during the hunting season, take care. Now, I'm not quite sure, as management systems go, how effective it is to hope that you're not going to get shot by somebody who confuses you for a wild boar. I suppose don't go out dressed as a wild boar is a good piece of advice. But maybe don't go out when people are firing guns is probably a better piece of advice. So, management systems, again, have a part to play. And you take them in the context of everything else that I've talked about before. Then you've got mitigation planning. You can go through structured systems to create those management systems and to decide which of those various approaches I've just described are the appropriate ones for your environment. And there are all sorts of ISMEC, UDA, there are all sorts, any number of acronyms you care to name that business management gurus have thrown together over the years, which could be applied to that. But you need to think about where you're going to put your resources, because you can guarantee you will not have enough resources to manage every single risk that there is facing your business. So you've got to pick your battles with care. And I've left -5 minutes for questions. I'm sorry.